hello, and you're very welcome to our very first video for our Sofa Symphony listening party. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be exploring some of the greatest examples of Western classical music. We're going to become familiar with the creators and the times in which the music was written. We're going to delve into the music itself and find out what makes these great works tick. And we're going to do that in a way that will draw you, the listener, in and let us all feel as if we're part of the performance. We are coming to you today from the stage of the historic White Memorial Theatre in Clonmel. And like all performance spaces throughout the world right now, the stage is empty and the audience seats are vacant. But it won't stay like that forever. And to give us a little taste of what will be in store for us when music and all performance returns, we have put together this programme. As part of the Healthy Ireland Keep Well initiative this spring, and with assistance from the Tipperary County Council, the Sofa Symphony listening party will allow you to connect with other music fans throughout Tipperary and listen online together to this great music and to discover great performances and to comment and engage with each other on our online comments board. To guide you through this music, we have created these special videos that give you an overview and a little bit of a preview of each work before we listen. And also, we provide you with a helpful infographic guide that you can use while listening. Of course you can, and I would encourage this as much as possible, just simply sit back, listen, and enjoy the music over the next few weeks. The music, it's not just great tunes and colourful sounds, even though it is that as well, but they're also among the greatest artworks ever created. And any time spent with them will deepen our appreciation for all music and all art, perhaps especially so now in these times. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in 1685 in Eisenach, which is located in Thuringia, the Midlands of modern-day Germany. And being born a Bach in that area at that time meant one thing and one thing alone. You were going to be a musician. The Bach musical dynasty had been founded nearly 50 years beforehand by Wietse Bach, a miller who, due to his Lutheran faith, had moved to Germany from Hungary and who delighted while he worked in playing a cittern, which is a stringed instrument very similar to our Irish bouzouki. This blend of deep faith, music, and a strong work ethic was present throughout the entire Bach family line and reached its height with Johann Sebastian. His output of work, with their unique power and their sense of musical drama, are unlike anything else in music, in both instrumental and in vocal music. His work sits at the very head of the top table. Despite the incredible gifts that Bach possessed, his life was never really without struggle. By the time he was 10, he had lost his mother and father within a year of each other. He routinely came into conflict with figures of authority, and he had a reputation for being difficult. In 1717, he was imprisoned for trying to leave his position as court organist in Weimar. Eventually, he was dishonorably discharged from that role and became the musical director or Kapellmeister at the court of Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, which this turned out to be Bach's dream job. Prince Leopold loved his music and loved Bach. The musicians the prince had collected in his court were of the very highest quality, and in this period, Bach wrote some of his greatest instrumental works. Of course, it was never going to last. 6 years after this arrival, the prince was married, and the new princess did not care for music, or in particular, Bach. Sensing his time in Köthen was heading for another exit, he needed a strategy, and it was at this point that the Brandenburg concertos entered the story. A few years earlier, Bach had travelled to Berlin to purchase a new harpsichord. And while there, he played for the Margrave of Brandenburg, who had been impressed enough by what he had heard to suggest Bach maybe sometime send him some music. Very non-committal. But when his time was up in Köthen, it was enough for Bach to act on. The 6 orchestral works that we now call the Brandenburg concertos, or concerti, if you want to be totally accurate, are essentially the musical resume of J.S. Bach, aged 37. It's a job application, and this is his portfolio and CV. There was even, going along with this, a cover letter that is very hard to read now without cringing at Bach's grovelling. But also, there's an awareness there of this is where musicians stood in relation to nobles in the grand scheme of things. But in these concerti, he's his true confident self. In the works he's constantly pushing the envelope. He's expanding the scope of orchestral music. There's an energy and there's an inventiveness that leaps from the page. This is a composer who's really stretching the boundaries, and truth be told, in the process, probably doing a little bit of showing off. Perhaps the provincial Bach couldn't resist putting it up to the urban knights of Brandenburg and Berlin. In the end, Bach did not get the gig in Brandenburg. We don't know if Bach even received a perfunctory brush-off of thanks for the effort, but, very interesting. The Brandenburg Concerti were neatly filed away in Brandenburg, and they stayed there for another 128 years until rediscovered in 1849. We should be thankful for that example of bureaucratic efficiency, because of the 9 orchestral concerti of Bach that have survived, only 3 of them are not from the Brandenburg collection. Concertos are among the earliest music that we can call symphonic. They grew out of the opera house and the opening overture of an opera. The Italian version of the overture was called a sinfonia, and out of that we have symphony. Bach adored Italian music, especially that of the Red Priest, Antonio Vivaldi. His most famous work, The Four Seasons, is an example of a concerto solo, where a single instrumentalist is featured, plus orchestra. The other 2 types of concerto are the concerto ripieno, which is for strings and bass, and the concerto grosso, which is for 2 or more instruments, plus orchestra. The Brandenburg concertos are an example of the concerto grosso, where there is a small group of musicians. In concerto number 2, it's a trumpet, recorder, oboe, and violin. And in concerto number 5, it's violin, flute, and harpsichord. This smaller group plays in what's called a concertino, which literally means the little ensemble. The drama of a concerto is driven by this competition between the concertino and then the orchestra for the listener's attention. The form, that is to say the recognized musical structure of this piece, is called ritornello form. That is when a main theme is played at the beginning in full by both the concertino and the orchestra, in tutti. In tutti means Italian for everything. So this foundation melody then returns in a variety of shapes and guises, usually just snippets and fragments sometimes, and it's punctuated by these soloist sections of the concertino group. The effect is kind of like real quick jump cuts, where the orchestra and the soloist swap the lead every 2 bars. But eventually, the smaller group comes to dominate. And a lot of that is down to the incredible instrumental writing. In concerto number 2, which will be the first concerto, we will listen to, it has a very memorable opening trumpet part. On a modern valve trumpet, the Brandenburg Concerto number 2 is regarded as a tough part to play. But it wasn't written for today's modern valve trumpet. It was written for a clarino, which is a Baroque trumpet that is long-coiled tube that has no valves. Bach had assembled around him the highest quality of musicians in Cothen, and to Johann Schreiber, he gave this most famous opening in music. The keyboard part that's in Concerto number 5 is so challenging that it's only likely that it was written for the composer himself. It's dazzlingly complex. It builds to such a tremendous climax that music historians regard this movement as the birth of the piano concerto. So it's probably no surprise Bach didn't get the call up to Brandenburg. Their musicians would have taken one look at the opening title page and said, "You can't play that," and probably shoved it into the filing cabinet. Brandenburg Concerto number 2 opens with this brilliant trumpet part that I'm going to play in full. There's great energy and great life in that opening when it comes in, and you can imagine it must be great fun to play. After that full statement of the main theme, we're not going to hear it again in full until the very end. What happens is we get the concertino group comes in, first in one solo instrument at a time. First, it's the violin, and where it comes. And then back to the concertino, then back to the full group, back to the concertino. And this carries on throughout the whole first movement. There are 6 large parts to this movement where this interplay between the concertino and the orchestra play out. Until we get to a coda near the end, which is a sort of a fake ending. And then we modulate through a series of keys until landing back in the tonic, which is the main key, the home key, to deliver one last statement of that ritornello theme. After that energetic first movement, we come into the second movement, and there's a big contrast between the two. In the second movement, we have none of the strings of the orchestra, and we also have no trumpet in the concertino group. That contrast is helpful for 2 reasons. One, for the trumpeter, who absolutely needs a break after blowing continuously for nearly 10 minutes. And secondly, because after an energetic, fast-paced movement in a major key, like the first movement was, it's nice to have this contrasting second movement in a minor key. It's a much smaller group of musicians in this section too. We have the violin, oboe and flute from the concertino group, and just a harpsichord accompaniment and cello in the orchestra. The theme that opens up is very kind of melancholy and sad, and everything that comes afterwards is almost built on it. Near the end of this movement, we have this coda, which is built on these falling figures in the melody. With the third movement, we're back to a lot of a similarity between that and the first movement. It's a very highly energetic in the major key. And also we're back with the trumpet, who has the main theme at the opening. And I'm just going to play that in full for you. As you can tell, it probably sounds very, very familiar to the main melody in the first movement, and that's intentional. It's in the same key, and it has the same rhythmic pattern as the opening movement. So, very similar again. When the instruments of the concertino group come in, they come in a certain order. It's first trumpet, then oboe, then violin, and then recorder. And they enter in imitation. So what that means is that the trumpet will come in first, and after a few bars, the oboe will come in imitating what the trumpet has played. A few bars after that, the violin comes in imitating what the oboe has played, who was imitating the trumpet. And a few bars after the violin, the recorder comes in, who's imitating the violin, who is imitating the oboe, who is imitating the original melody of the trumpet. Now, it doesn't always happen as strictly as that, but that gives you an idea of when you're listening to it, what to be listening out for and when these entries come in. Overall, there's 4 sections which are of the solo instruments and 5 sections where it's the solo instruments, the concertino group, and the full orchestra. That brings us into the end. It's a shorter movement than the opening one and brings the whole Brandenburg Concerto into a nice, neat, swift ending. In Brandenburg Concerto number 5, the makeup of the instruments is different. In the concertino section now, we have the flute or recorder, we have a violin, and we have the harpsichord. The main theme is delivered right at the very beginning. It's very energetic. If we play a sort of a simplified version of it, it just goes... So it's a very long, quite complex theme that goes through a lot of changes. And when it is played by the orchestra, it's played a little bit more energetically than what I did there. There's a little double tap energy. Every note is hit twice. So in fact, it is. So very frenetic from the off. It's a really energetic, really lively piece of music. By now, after listening to the first Brandenburg Concerto, we should be getting comfortable with this swapping and the playing with the themes that happens in a ritornello form. You hear the melody stated once and in full, and then little snippets of it build apart and are developed and punctuated by these solo sections from that smaller concertino group, this time of just flute, violin and harpsichord. With this movement, at the end, we have this incredible, which I'm not going to attempt to play, harpsichord solo that many people look at as the beginning of the piano concerto. Up till now, the harpsichord was an accompaniment instrument. As the name suggests, a harpsichord has its foundation in a harp. It's a harp moved onto its back, and instead of being plucked with fingers, it's being plucked with little plectrums, which are controlled by a keyboard. Up until now, it was only really used to fill out harmonies, never as a solo instrument in its own regard. Bach would bring it out of the shadows of accompaniment and into the limelight with a solo for the harpsichord in that final section. That's really unlike anything else written up till now. Bach would often lead the orchestra at Cothen himself from either the harpsichord or the first violin. So the harpsichord part is so well written that there's no way he wasn't playing it. Movement 2 in this concerto is very like the middle movement of the previous Brandenburg Concerto in that it's a slow movement. But this one is more delicate and a little bit more skeletal than the previous concerto. We have just flute, the harpsichord and the violin. The main melody that is imitated across the other instruments has this really beautiful rise and fall, and it's almost like vocal music in places because we have a duet between the flute and the violin that's really expressive. Bach often gets a reputation for being mathematical, and it's hard to think of this music as being mathematical. So it's never really a good thing to call Bach that, because there's so many pieces of music like this that are just purely expressive. The melody that opens it up is. And with a bit of accompaniment, it would go like this. The final movement sticks to that template of having two outer fast movements and a slower inner movement. We're back to the opening key of D major, and the melody that we go with is a really lively jig melody. You can almost feel the urge to dance when you're hearing this. So really lively music. And in this movement, we have a lot of playing against one another, a lot of these imitation of the instruments following each other after a few bars. And it brings the whole thing to a really lively and satisfying climax. Bach didn't land the Brandenburg gig, as we said, but he did eventually find employment at the city of Leipzig. It was not a happy partnership. It was not his first choice, and he was their fourth choice. Amongst his duties would be Latin lessons for the young choristers. But he stuck it out for the next 27 years until his death in 1750 at the age of 65. In that time, he had to compose within the guidelines of the city council, who mandated that he should make compositions that are not too theatrical. He still managed to compose over 300 cantatas, the Goldberg Variations, the St. John's Passion, the St. Matthew's Passion, and countless other works, many of which have been lost over time. Because while Bach was highly regarded in his own lifetime as a keyboard player and improviser, his music was increasingly out of style with the newer classical trend of clean and balanced theme with an easily identifiable melody and an accompaniment. His own sons became embarrassed with their fathers clinging in his dotage to complicated counterpoint and fugues and excessive busyness. And so did most other people, until 80 years after his death, when the composer Felix Mendelssohn almost single-handedly revived Bach's reputation with a performance of St. John's Passion. Since then, the Brandenburg Concerti have gone on to be the single most representational work of this era of music. In another sense, they've become the single most representational musical work of humanity. In 1977, NASA launched the Voyager spacecraft, and on the side of it is a gold disc that it contains sounds and images to represent the planet Earth. The idea being that if it's to be played by any terrestrial life that encounters the vessel. Side 1, track 1, is the Brandenburg Concerto, number 2, first movement. So maybe we're trying to show off too. So hopefully that's given you some little preparation of the music that we're going to listen to tonight. We're going to listen to, first of all, Brandenburg Concerto number 2, which has that great trumpet opening, and Brandenburg Concerto number 5, which has that incredible harpsichord part. These performances tonight that we're listening to is by the Age of Enlightenment Orchestra, so they're what's called as historically informed. So that means that the instruments that they're using are very close to what the instruments this music was originally written for. All that remains for me to say is that I hope you really enjoy it, that you grab yourself a glass of wine or a cup of tea and find the nearest sofa or wherever you're comfortable to sit down and enjoy this. And don't forget to come online and look at the comments that will be on our Discord page. So I hope you enjoy that. And next week, we're going to be looking at the music of Ludwig van Beethoven, and specifically his Fifth Symphony, the famous Fifth Symphony in C minor, with the very famous opening with the Hammers of Fate theme. Until then, enjoy Bach, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.